The night the mirror spoke began like so many others along the Quai des Orfèvres, with the Seine sliding past in its dark, indifferent silence and the faint glow of kerosene lamps trembling behind the office windows. Inspector Moreau had been lingering over a file he had read too many times, the smoke from his cigarette drifting upward in thin, wavering lines that looked almost like fingers searching for a way out. Paris was unusually still for March. Even the fog seemed to hesitate before spilling through the alleys near Pont Neuf. Yet in that stillness, a faint tremor pulsed through the city, the kind that slips beneath the floorboards before anyone recognizes it as the beginning of something. When the telegram arrived, creased, watermarked, the handwriting unsteady as though written by someone watching their own hand from a distance, Moreau did not immediately sense the strangeness. Only later would he recall that the paper had carried a faint scent of lavender, the sort one might find in a shuttered provincial house where the windows had not been opened in years. The message was brief. A woman claimed her husband, dead for nearly a decade, had begun speaking to her again. His voice, she said, was coming through a mirror. The case did not yet exist on paper. There were no witnesses, no footprints, no suspects waiting in cafes thick with smoke. There was only that trembling telegram and the memory of a name Moreau had once heard murmured during a winter inquiry in the outskirts of Tours. But even then, as he folded the telegram and slipped it into his coat, he felt the first shift inside himself, the subtle tightening of curiosity that comes when the rational world tilts slightly and reveals, if only for a breath, the outline of something darker and unseen. Some cases arrive with noise, shouts from neighbors, frantic knocks at the commissariat door. Others step quietly across your threshold and wait until you are alone before speaking. This one whispered first, and it whispered through glass. If you find yourself drawn into the fog-soaked corners of Inspector Moreau's Paris, linger with us a little longer. Let the story unfold, and if its shadows compel you, feel free to share it, leave a trace of your passing, and follow along for the next journey beyond the lamplight. Now let us return to the mirror. Inspector Moreau had walked the incline of Rue des Martyrs many times before, yet on that grey morning the street felt altered, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Vendors were only beginning to lift their shutters, sending small echoes through the mist that clung to the facades like a shroud. The air tasted faintly of last night's rain and the iron tang that lingered whenever the wind moved through the narrow corridor between Montmartre and central Paris. Moreau's boots tapped a deliberate rhythm against the uneven stones as he approached the building described in the telegram. It was an aging structure, its paint cracked, its entryway shadowed by an awning that sagged from years of weather. A brass bell hung beside the door, its surface dulled by countless fingers. When he pressed it, the sound wandered up the stairwell like a small metallic ghost searching for an ear willing to listen. The widow lived on the 3rd floor. As Moreau ascended the narrow staircase, he felt the slight tremble of each step beneath his weight. On the 2nd landing, he passed a door left ajar, revealing a child chasing a wooden hoop across a dim room. The child glanced at him, wide-eyed, then quickly retreated behind the safety of the door frame. Such fragments of life floated everywhere in the older quarters of Paris, tiny spectacles witnessed and forgotten by most. But Moreau noted them, the same way he noted the smell of warm bread rising from a nearby bakery, or the faint trace of soap in the stairwell that someone had attempted to scrub clean but abandoned halfway through. These ordinary details grounded him, reminding him that even the strangest cases lived somewhere within the rhythm of the familiar. When he reached the widow's door, his hand paused before knocking. He listened. Silence. Heavy and waiting. Then a rustle like fabric brushing against wood. He knocked once, firm but not intrusive. The door opened a crack, and a pale eye peered out, framed by strands of grey hair. The woman behind it spoke his name before he introduced himself, her whisper floating through the gap like breath escaping a cold mirror. Inspector Moreau. It was not a greeting. It was a confirmation, as though she had known he would come even before she sent the telegram. She opened the door wider. Madame Elise Charenton was a slender figure draped in a faded blue shawl, her posture slightly bent, not with age alone, but with something heavier, an emotional weight that seemed to press her inward. Her apartment smelled faintly of lavender and dust, the scent merging with the stale air of closed windows. Heavy curtains filtered the weak daylight, casting the room in a muted amber that softened the edges of the furniture. Moreau removed his hat and stepped inside, noting the meticulous arrangement of objects. Porcelain figures lined along a mantel, letters tied with ribbon resting atop a desk, and a small table set with a single teacup, as though prepared in anticipation of someone's arrival. The mirror stood against the far wall. It was tall, framed in dark wood, carved with delicate patterns worn by time. Its surface gleamed unnaturally compared to the rest of the room, as though it had been polished with great care. Moreau felt an odd sensation as he approached it, not of fear, but of being watched by something that lived only in reflection. He turned to the widow. "Madame Charenton," he said softly, "I received your telegram. You wrote that your husband's voice has spoken to you." She closed her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. "Yes," she murmured. "Not every night, but often enough that I no longer doubt it. He calls me by my name, the way he used to, with that softness he reserved only for apologies or for moments when he wished to persuade me." A tremor passed through her words, not quite grief, not quite fear. Moreau sensed that her emotions were layered, woven through years of memories she had not fully confronted. "Tell me when it began," he said. She gestured toward a worn armchair and took her seat opposite him, hands clasped in her lap. Her gaze drifted toward the mirror, as though the story itself insisted on being told through the glass. "It started 3 weeks ago," she said. "Just after midnight. I'd been unable to sleep. The room felt colder than usual, and I stood before the mirror to fetch a shawl from the drawer beside it. That was when I heard him. His voice came from behind the glass, as though he were standing just on the other side." Moreau leaned slightly forward, watching her expression rather than the mirror. "What did he say?" She swallowed. Her fingers tightened until her knuckles blanched. "He said my name. Elise. Just that at first. Then, the following night, he said he had things to tell me, things he could not speak of before he died." Moreau allowed a pause to settle between them, letting her words choose their own weight. He had encountered many widows in his years at the Quai des Orfèvres, each with their unique language of grief. But there was something different about Madame Charenton's tone. An undercurrent of defense, as though she felt compelled to justify each detail before he questioned it. "Your husband," he said, "how long has he been deceased?" 9 years, she replied. "They said it was his heart, but I have always wondered." Her eyes drifted again toward the mirror. Moreau let his gaze follow. The mirror reflected only the muted room, their silhouettes blurred by the soft curtains that filtered the morning light. Yet something about the glass felt tense, as though it held its own breath. He rose slowly and approached it, studying the frame. The carvings were elegant but aged, small curls of wood that spiraled into one another. He noticed faint scratches near the bottom edge, initials perhaps, though time had smoothed them nearly flat. The widow watched him closely. "I cannot explain it," she said, "but when he speaks, the glass seems to darken. Only for a moment. I thought at first it was my imagination, but I see it clearly now. Every time." Moreau stepped back and faced her. "Has anyone else heard the voice?" She shook her head. "No, I have not told anyone else. They would think me fragile. Or mad." Her lips trembled as though she had spoken something she feared. "Why send for me, madame?" he asked gently. Her gaze sharpened with sudden intensity. "Because he warned me. she whispered. "He said I was not safe, that someone was coming, someone who knew the truth." Moreau felt a subtle shift within himself, the familiar tightening of instinct that distinguished ordinary superstition from a matter requiring caution. He returned to his chair and folded his hands. "What truth?" She hesitated, her breath shallow. Then her voice dropped to a whisper. "He said he did not die the way they claimed. He said someone helped him into the grave." The room felt still, as though the dust floating in the air had paused mid-flight. Moreau studied her face carefully. There was sincerity in her eyes, but also something concealed, a flicker of guilt or fear she could not entirely suppress. "Did you believe him?" he asked. She exhaled shakily. "I do not know what to believe anymore. I loved him, Inspector. But he was not an easy man. He had debts, secrets, and friends who vanished when he died." Her voice faltered. "And perhaps I too have secrets I have tried to bury." The admission hung between them like a faint scent that could not be traced to its source. Moreau felt the weight of the case begin to anchor itself. The widow's tremors were not merely from fear. There were fractures in her past that this strange phenomenon, the voice, the mirror, the warnings, was now forcing open. He rose once more and approached the mirror, letting his fingertips hover just short of the glass. The reflection showed his hand, steady and unblinking. No shift in the light, no tremor. But he felt, deep within his chest, the sense of standing before a threshold he had not yet named. "Madame Charenton," he said quietly, "I will examine every part of this, but I must ask you to rest for now. I may return later today with additional questions." She nodded, though her expression remained distant, as though part of her mind had drifted into the mirror's depths. As Moreau approached the door, she called to him softly, "Inspector, if he speaks again, what should I do?" He turned, feeling the weight of her fragile hope pressing into the room. "Listen carefully," he said, "and do nothing until I return." Her voice quivered. "You do not think I am imagining it?" Moreau's gaze drifted briefly toward the mirror before returning to her. "I think," he said, "that whatever is happening here deserves to be understood." He stepped into the stairwell. The door closed behind him with a muted thud. As he descended the dim staircase, he felt the quiet of the building gather around him, as though the walls themselves had absorbed her fear. When he reached the street, the fog had thickened. He paused, glancing back at the third-floor window. It remained shuttered, unmoving, yet he felt a gaze upon him, not from the street nor from the passers-by who hurried about their morning errands. It was the faint, unmistakable sensation of being observed from behind glass. The fog still clung to the lower quarters of Paris by the time Inspector Moreau returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, forming pale ribbons that drifted between the bridges like forgotten scraps of breath. Inside the building, the familiar scent of ink, damp wool, and coffee grounds enveloped him. Clerks murmured over ledgers, typewriter keys clacked in irregular bursts, and a sergeant at the front desk argued with a delivery boy about a missing receipt. It was the usual morning chaos, yet Moreau carried with him the echo of the widow's trembling voice and the strangeness of that mirror gleaming too brightly in a room otherwise surrendered to dust. He moved through the corridor toward his office, where a small stack of correspondence waited on his desk like a silent accusation. Amid the mundane forms and reports lay the telegram that had summoned him the night before. He placed it carefully under the lamplight, smoothing its creased surface. Its faint lavender scent rose once more, soft yet persistent, as though the perfume had seeped into the very fibers of the paper. He had smelled the same fragrance in the widow's apartment, but subtler there, diluted by time and stale air. Here, in the enclosed stillness of his office, the scent felt almost intrusive, like an unwelcome memory trying to reclaim its place. Moreau studied the handwriting again. the letters tilted slightly to the right, shaped with hesitation rather than elegance. A distinct tremor marked the downward strokes, particularly in the capital initials. This was not the hand of a woman writing in calm. It belonged to someone caught between fear and confession. He reread the brief message. It mentioned the voice, the mirror, and the plea for him to come at once, but it also contained something else, a line that had unsettled him even before he reached Rue des Martyrs. "It has started again," she had written. Again. That single word suggested a history she had not revealed. He lit a cigarette and leaned back, letting the cigarette smoke mingle with the lavender scent. His mind sifted through the fragments of the morning, the widow's pallor, the worn initials carved into the mirror frame, the sudden terror in her eyes when she spoke of being warned. He had seen women unravel under the weight of grief, but there was more to Madame Charenton's fear than sorrow. There was expectation, as though she believed some long-delayed reckoning had finally arrived. A firm knock sounded on his door. Janvier entered without waiting for a reply, his coat dripping from the mist outside. Janvier was younger, with a quiet steadiness and eyes that absorbed details others missed. "You sent for me, Inspector?" Moreau gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit. I want your thoughts on something." He handed the telegram across the desk. Janvier read it with his usual calm, though his brows knit slightly at the mention of the voice. "Do you know her?" Janvier asked. "No," Moreau replied. "But her husband's name, Charenton, stirs a faint recollection. Something I heard years ago during that winter assignment, near Tours. A case involving a quarrel, perhaps. A rumor about debts. Nothing definite." Janvier laid the telegram down gently. "And you believe she truly heard someone speak through the mirror?" "I believe she believes it," Moreau said. "The rest we will discover." His tone was certain, but in truth he could not dismiss the strange sensation he felt while standing before the mirror. He had encountered illusions, manipulations, tricks of light and sound. Yet none of those had felt quite like this. It was not the mirror itself that troubled him, but the weight of something unspoken hovering around it. Lucas arrived shortly after, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor before he stepped through the doorway. Lucas always carried an air of impatience, as though the city's problems were an inconvenience he endured out of habit rather than duty. He tossed his hat onto a chair and eyed the telegram. "Ghosts now?" he said with a smirk. "We don't have enough living fools in Paris, so the dead must join them." Moreau ignored the remark. Madame Charenton's husband died 9 years ago. Yet she claims his voice has returned, and she hinted that his death might not have been as straightforward as recorded. Lucas grunted. The dead rarely stay at peace when inheritance is involved. "It may be more than that," Moreau said. "There's a history here, a provincial one." At the mention of Tours, Lucas's expression shifted slightly. "That region breeds quiet scandals," he muttered, "the kind that fester instead of erupt." Moreau nodded. "Which is why I want both of you to dig into the widow's past, her marriage, her husband's debts, any disputes, quarrels, or strange incidents near the time of his death, and look for any mention of mirrors or objects he might have obsessed over." Lucas raised an eyebrow but complied. Janvier, more measured, offered a thoughtful nod. "You believe the telegram connects to something older," he said. "I believe nothing happens in isolation," Moreau replied. Once they departed, Moreau placed the telegram back in his coat pocket. Something about the lavender scent had not left his mind. It was not a common choice. It reminded him of provincial estates where old families preserved habits long out of fashion. He recalled a winter case near Tours where a similar scent had lingered in an abandoned study. And with that memory, another surfaced, an overheard conversation among locals mentioning the Charenton name. A quarrel in a café, a man shouting about betrayal, a whispered claim that the dead man had left unfinished business. He extinguished his cigarette and rose. The fog outside had thinned, allowing more light to slip through the windows, casting a pale sheen across the Seine. He stepped outside, passing the river's slow current, and made his way toward the telegraph office. Inside, operators shuffled messages with the weary rhythm of men who spent their days translating the world's anxieties into coded lines. Moreau approached the clerk he trusted most, an older man with narrow spectacles. He handed him the telegram. "Can you trace where this was sent from?" Moreau asked. The clerk studied the stamp. "Not Paris," he murmured. "This originated near Montmartre, but not from a public office. A private operator, perhaps one of those old apartments with the in-house line." He adjusted his glasses. "Strange, though. This signature mark, see here, it hasn't been used in years, almost as if the equipment itself is outdated." Moreau absorbed this. An outdated transmitter, lavender-scented paper, and handwriting marked by fear. "Thank you," he said, retrieving the telegram. Outside again, he paused at the street corner. The widow had said the voice returned 3 weeks ago. What had changed then? Had someone approached her? Had she received other messages, or had she, perhaps, discovered something in her apartment she had not intended to find? The widow's hesitation suggested she was withholding details, not out of deceit, but because speaking them aloud would force her to confront memories she had long buried. When Moreau returned to his office, Janvier was already there, holding a folded paper. "Inspector," he said, "I checked preliminary records. There is mention of Monsieur Charenton's estate near Tours. The ownership passed to his wife after his death, but there were disputes. A cousin contested the will. The matter was settled quietly." "Quietly," Moreau repeated, tasting the word, which often means someone wanted it forgotten. "There is more," Janvier said. "The house had a large mirror in the main room, a unique one according to a neighbor's account. Imported from Italy decades ago, it was rumored to have belonged to an actress before she fell into ruin." Moreau's mind sharpened. Was this mirror moved to Paris after the estate was closed? "Yes," Janvier replied. "It was among the few items she brought with her. A mirror with a history. A widow who looked at it late at night. A voice returning after 9 years. Whatever haunted Madame Charenton, real or imagined, had begun long before she stepped into that apartment on Rue des Martyrs. As Janvier left, Lucas entered with a scowl. "Inspector, one more thing. The death certificate, it appears the doctor who signed it moved away from Tours shortly after. No forwarding address." Moreau felt a familiar chill, not one caused by superstition, but by the scent of a truth hidden beneath polite records. "Find him," he said. "Alive or dead. I want to know where he went." Lucas scratched his chin. "You think there was foul play?" "I think the dead do not speak," Moreau replied, "unless the living give them a voice." He stepped toward the window overlooking the Seine. Afternoon light had begun to pierce the lingering fog, brightening the water into slow, shifting silver. Somewhere across the city, in a dim apartment heavy with lavender and dust, a widow waited beside a mirror that held her past like a captive breath, and someone, somewhere, had decided that past should no longer remain silent. The morning train to Tours rattled through the outskirts of Paris with a steady, weary rhythm, as though the carriages themselves had grown accustomed to carrying the city's unanswered questions into the quieter provinces. Inspector Moreau sat near the window, watching the landscape unfold in muted tones. The fog thinned as the train moved south, revealing flat fields veined with irrigation channels and clusters of bare trees that shivered in the early spring wind. Here and there, small farmhouses rose like forgotten punctuation marks, their chimneys releasing thin spirals of smoke into the pale sky. The countryside always struck Moreau as deceptively peaceful. Behind the calm lingered old resentments, secrets whispered in taverns, and memories preserved not in documents, but in the stubborn hearts of those who had lived through scandal. Moreau folded his coat across his lap and removed the telegram once more. He studied the handwriting again, tracing its tremors with his eyes. Everything about this case felt as though it pulsed beneath its own surface, like something submerged but not yet drowned. Tours was not far from the place where he had once conducted an inquiry involving a missing farmhand and a suspicious barn fire. During that winter, he had overheard the name Charenton more than once. It had drifted through conversations like an afterthought, mentioned by men who leaned too close to their glasses and by women whose eyes darted toward the door before speaking. At the time, Moreau had not pressed. It had not been relevant to the fire. Yet now those stray fragments stirred again, restless, demanding attention. The train slowed as it entered the outskirts of Tours, passing a cluster of abandoned warehouses whose rusted roofs clanged softly in the wind. Soon the station appeared, a modest building with a clock tower slightly askew, its hands twitching toward noon. Moreau stepped onto the platform, inhaling the sharper provincial air. The scent here differed from Paris, a blend of damp soil, chimney smoke, and the faint sweetness of bakeries preparing their midday loaves. He walked through the station and into the town square, where a wide fountain stood drained for the season, its stone basin collecting fallen leaves. His first stop was the Hôtel du Nord, an old inn run by a man named Marcadier, whose memory stretched further than he claimed. Moreau had known him during past inquiries and trusted him to recall the details others forgot or ignored. The inn's lobby smelled of wax polish and aging timber. Marcadier was behind the counter, wiping dust from a ledger. When he looked up and recognized Moreau, his eyebrows rose. "Inspector Moreau?" He said, "I haven't seen you since that business with the barn fire. What brings you back to Tours?" "A name," Moreau replied. Charenton. A shadow passed briefly across Marcadier's expression. He set the ledger aside. "Ah, that one. Not a name you hear often anymore." "What do you remember?" Moreau asked. Marcadier gestured toward a table near the window. They sat, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice, though no one else occupied the room. Monsieur Charenton was a complicated man, charming when he wished to be, cold when he didn't. He was the sort who left impressions but never roots. People spoke of him in undertones, not because they feared him, but because they weren't certain what he was capable of. Moreau listened intently. "And his wife?" Marcadier shrugged. "A quiet woman. Kind, if withdrawn. She rarely came into town. He kept her mostly at the estate. The few times I saw her, she seemed tense, like someone listening for footsteps behind her." The description aligned too neatly with the widow Moreau had met in Paris, a tension that lingered not only from grief, but from something older, harder to define. "Tell me about the estate," Moreau said. "It stood about 2 kilometers outside town," Marcadier replied. Large, though run down in its last years. The shutters always half closed, the garden overgrown, but the interior, so people said, held relics of a better age. That mirror, for one. Moreau felt a quiet shift within him. It was known. "Oh yes," Marcadier said. "A tall, ornate thing. People spoke of it as though it carried its own history. They said the actress who owned it before the Charenton's used it to rehearse her lines, watching herself become someone else each night. After her ruin, she sold it in desperation. Charenton bought it cheap. He liked beautiful things, even when he couldn't afford them." "Did he have debts?" Moreau asked. "Mountains," Marcadier muttered. "He gambled, made promises he couldn't keep. There were whispers that he owed favors to dangerous men, but nothing was ever proven." Moreau leaned back, absorbing the information. "His death. What do you recall?" "Sudden," Marcadier said softly. "People accepted it quickly. The doctor declared it heart failure, but the night before there had been shouting. It carried across the courtyard, loud enough that even distant neighbors heard it. And then, silence. A quarrel. A sudden death. A widow left with an estate full of secrets and a mirror that followed her to Paris. "Did anyone question the circumstances?" Moreau asked. "A few," Marcadier said, "but the widow left soon after the burial. The estate was stripped, debts settled, disputes hushed. People prefer silence when it comes to uncomfortable truth." Moreau considered this. "I need directions to the estate." Marcadier hesitated. "It's abandoned now, dangerous in places, but I can draw you a route." Within minutes, Moreau was walking along a dirt path that led beyond the outskirts of town. The wind stirred the tall grass, carrying with it the faint sound of distant church bells. After 20 minutes, he reached the gates of the former Charenton property. The wrought-iron structure hung lopsided, one hinge broken. Vines crept up the fence as though trying to swallow the last remains of the estate's dignity. Moreau stepped through and followed the overgrown path to the house. The building loomed ahead, its facade peeling, windows dark and hollow. The front door resisted before groaning open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of long-disused rooms. Moreau moved cautiously through the foyer, his footsteps echoing. He entered the main salon, where faint impressions in the wooden floorboards suggested where large pieces of furniture once stood. A rectangular outline on the wall drew his attention, the distinct shape of a mirror long removed. He approached the outline, tracing its edges with his fingertips. The wall beneath was slightly cleaner, protected from the dust that covered the rest of the room. A small inscription, almost invisible, was etched into the wooden paneling. Initials, 2 pairs, intertwined. The second pair was not the widow's. Moreau straightened slowly. A story was forming, one the widow had not told him. A story that began long before her husband's death and did not end with her departure from Tours. As he moved deeper into the house, he found remnants of letters scattered in a drawer, most unreadable, but one fragment legible enough. She must never know. The signature was incomplete, but the handwriting bore a faint resemblance to the style on the telegram. Same tilted letters, same trembling downward strokes. Had someone else learned to mimic it, or had the widow written more than she admitted? Outside the salon window, the sky had darkened, threatening rain. Moreau stepped out into the courtyard, where the broken fountain gaped like a toothless mouth. The estate felt inhabited by absences, voices unsaid, choices unconfessed. He stood there for a moment, collecting the weight of what he had learned. The widow had not merely lived with a difficult man, she had lived within a tangle of lies that still breathed beneath the soil of Tours. The mirror had been witness to quarrels, secrets, perhaps even violence. Whatever spoke to her through the glass now, whether a living voice or her frayed conscience, was awakening something the estate had tried to bury. As Moreau walked back toward town, the shadows lengthened across the path. The wind pressed against his coat, urging him onward. He felt the investigation tightening, threading him directly into a story that had waited years for someone to return and listen. By the time Inspector Moreau returned to Paris, night had settled over the city like a velvet shroud. The lamps along the Seine flickered uncertainly in the wind, casting trembling patches of gold across the water. Moreau walked from the station toward the Quai des Orfèvres with the steady pace of a man carrying more questions than answers. Tours had not given him certainty, but it had given shape to the unease Madame Charenton had breathed into the air of her apartment. A quarrel, a sudden death, a mirror with an old inscription, and a trail of debts that vanished too conveniently. These were not fragments of superstition. They were seeds of something deliberate, something that had not finished speaking. He entered the Quai des Orfèvres as clerks were extinguishing lamps and stacking forms for the morning. His office was dim, the lamplight soft and amber against the worn wooden desk. He removed his coat, lit a cigarette, and laid the folded telegram beside a small sketch he had made of the inscription in the abandoned estate. 2 sets of initials, one belonging to Charenton's wife, the other belonging to someone not yet identified. The letters intertwined in a way that suggested intimacy, secrecy, perhaps even betrayal. Moreau exhaled slowly. The case was no longer simply about a widow frightened by a voice in a mirror. It was about a marriage built upon something hidden and a death that had closed a door too abruptly. But there was more. The mirror itself had been a witness to something, or had been used as one. The next morning, Moreau made his way along the river to a workshop known for restoring old frames and instruments. The craftsman, Monsieur Duret, had hands stained with varnish and eyes that seemed able to read the history of an object simply by touching it. His shop smelled of resin, sawdust, and aging wood. When Moreau arrived, Duret was bent over a half-restored violin, the strings removed and the varnish stripped to reveal the pale grain beneath. He looked up with a smile that dissolved upon seeing Moreau's serious expression. "I need your expertise," Moreau said without preamble. A mirror, 19th century, wooden frame, carved, possibly Italian. It once hung in an estate near Tours. Now it stands in a widow's bedroom in Paris. I need to know what could be hidden in such a frame. Duret set aside the violin carefully. Hidden? In what sense? Compartments, mechanisms, something that could convey sound. Duret's brows rose. Ah, theatrical illusions. Those old frames. You'd be surprised what some artisans built into them, especially mirrors used in private performances. They could hold resonant cavities, sound channels, even concealed tubes. But you say this one was brought from a provincial estate. Interesting. Many such mirrors were repurposed. Moreau leaned against the workbench, watching as Duret wiped his hands on a cloth. If someone wished to create the illusion of a voice, from the mirror specifically, how could they do it? Duret thought for a moment, running a finger along a carved violin peg as though tracing the memory of a forgotten technique. Sound can travel through wood. A frame could hide a thin conduit. But to create a voice, one would need proximity or wires, unless... He paused. Unless it was recorded. There were early devices, a kind of wax cylinder that actors used privately. But those left marks, heat damage, wax traces. If such a frame had held one, you'd see faint abrasions along the back. "The frame has scratches," Moreau said, "near the bottom edge. Worn, and initials carved long ago." Duret's eyes sharpened. Initials. Then the mirror likely once held sentimental value. Sometimes compartments were built for letters or messages. Moreau felt the faint stir of something aligning. Could someone speak through it? In the present, I mean. If they were close enough. Yes, Duret replied. If there were a hollow space behind the wall and the frame had been fitted to direct sound. But in a Paris apartment? Difficult, unless someone had access to the adjoining room. He tilted his head. "What do you suspect, Inspector?" Moreau extinguished his cigarette. "That someone wants the widow to believe her husband is speaking again." Duret's expression softened with unease. Cruel work, that. Cruelty, Moreau reflected, rarely acted alone. It traveled with motive. He thanked Duret and returned to the street. The wind had picked up, pushing scent of the river across the quays. He walked toward Rue des Martyrs with a growing certainty that whatever was happening in the widow's apartment was rooted not in the supernatural, but in a deliberate design. Yet the widow's terror had been real. Someone knew how to strike precisely at the fracture in her past. When he reached the building, Moreau paused before entering. The third-floor window was shuttered, just as it had been the day before. He climbed the stairs, each step creaking underfoot. At the widow's door he knocked once. No answer. He waited, listening. The faint rustle of movement floated from inside. He knocked again, softer. At last, the door opened. Madame Charenton stood before him, her shawl wrapped tightly as though holding her upright. Her face was paler than before, and her hands trembled. "Inspector," she whispered. It spoke again. He stepped inside. The room felt different, colder, as though the air had thinned. The curtains were half drawn, casting dim light across the mirror, which seemed to glow faintly in the muted shadows. Moreau's attention went immediately to the floor. A porcelain figure from the mantel now lay shattered near the rug. The widow followed his gaze. "It happened an hour ago," she said. "I was near the window when I heard my name. Elise. The way he said it the night before he died." She pressed a hand to her temple as though her memories were knives. I dropped the figurine. "Did you see anything in the mirror?" Moreau asked calmly. "No," she whispered. "Only my reflection. But the glass, it darkened again, as though something moved behind it." Moreau approached the mirror, standing close enough to feel its coolness radiating outward. He studied the frame, running a finger along the carved wood. The scratches near the bottom edge seemed almost purposeful now, their faint lines forming a pattern rather than wear. He crouched, examining the underside. A small sliver of wood protruded, almost invisible. It shifted slightly when pressed, a mechanism, or the remnants of one. He turned to the widow. "Have you moved the mirror recently?" "No," she said. "I keep it as it has always stood." "Has anyone entered your apartment in the past weeks?" "No one," she replied. Then her gaze faltered. Except for a man who delivered a parcel. 3 weeks ago, a book I did not order. I returned it." "What man?" "I don't know. He wore a cap. He didn't speak much." Moreau felt a ripple pass through him. 3 weeks ago, the same time the voice began. He stepped closer to the mirror. Its surface reflected his silhouette, the dim room behind him, and the widow standing near the window, but something else caught his eye, a faint smudge along the upper edge, as though a hand had touched it recently. He leaned in. The smudge carried a faint scent. Not lavender, something sharper, masculine, familiar. He straightened slowly. "Madame," he said softly, "when your husband was alive, did he ever accuse you of betrayal?" Her breath hitched. The room seemed to tighten around her. "Why do you ask?" "Because the voice you hear," he said carefully, "speaks with knowledge of guilt. And people rarely invent accusations they themselves do not fear." She sank into her chair, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. "I never betrayed him, Inspector, but he believed there was someone. He saw shadows in every corner. He doubted my letters, my errands, my silence. He believed the mirror held truths I could not speak." Moreau absorbed her words. "And the initials carved into the mirror? The ones beside yours?" She looked at him with startled eyes. "Initials? Mine?" Moreau hesitated. Her reaction was genuine. The widow did not know of the inscription, which meant someone else had placed it there. Someone involved with her husband long before his death. He approached the mirror again, feeling the weight of the room pressing inward. There was something behind the glass. Not a ghost, not a voice from beyond, but a history that had begun speaking again through the hands of the living. He turned to the widow. "I will need to examine the rear of this mirror, its frame, its placement against the wall." She nodded numbly. Moreau reached for the mirror's edge and shifted it outward. And there, behind it, he saw what he had suspected. A narrow channel carved into the wall, old but recently disturbed. A space that could carry sound. A space someone had used. Someone was imitating the voice of the dead, and they had been standing very, very close. The narrow channel carved behind the mirror stayed with Inspector Moreau long after he left the widow's apartment. He walked down Rue des Martyrs with the deliberate calm he adopted when his mind was working furiously beneath the surface. The daylight had thinned into a washed pale gold, the sort that made the city seem older and more fragile. Moreau made his way back toward the Seine, knowing that whatever haunted the widow was no accident. Someone had gone to great effort to stir old ghosts, and ghosts rarely rose without purpose. By the time he entered the Quai des Orfèvres, dusk was settling. Clerks snuffed out lamps one by one as the evening shift took its place. Moreau went directly to his office, shutting the door behind him. He laid his notes across the desk, placing the sketch of the initials beside the details, from Tours. 2 initials beside the widow's. A quarrel. A sudden death. A hidden mechanism behind the mirror. It all pointed toward a single truth. The death of Monsieur Charenton was not the simple heart failure recorded 9 years ago. Janvier arrived shortly after, carrying a stack of files under his arm. He placed them quietly on the desk. "I searched the municipal archives in Tours, as you asked," he said. "The death certificate is indeed irregular. The doctor who signed it, Dr. Armand Lavoisier, left Tours 2 weeks after the burial. No forwarding address, no record of him practicing elsewhere." Moreau did not look up immediately. "Did anyone question his departure?" "No," Janvier replied. "People assumed he left to join a relative in the south, but I found no proof, no ticket records or no letters filed with the town hall." Moreau closed his eyes briefly. Silence had buried more crimes in France than earth ever did. And Charenton's debts? Janvier nodded. He owed sums to 3 individuals, all of whom denied involvement. But one name appears repeatedly in the ledgers. A man named Louis d'Argel, known to loan money privately, not always legally. D'Argel. Moreau stood slowly. "Find him. He lives in Paris now," Janvier said. "A modest apartment near Rue Oberkampf." Moreau took his coat. "Good, we will speak to him." They left the Quai des Orfèvres together, the early night pressing cool air against them as they crossed the Pont Neuf. The river glimmered beneath, shifting like restless ink. On the opposite bank, they took a carriage to Oberkampf, where the streets grew narrower and the buildings leaned closer together as though sharing secrets. The neighborhood was alive with its usual chaos. Children shouting in the courtyards, men arguing over glasses of cheap wine, women hanging laundry from creaking balconies. D'Argels lived on the 2nd floor of a building whose plaster peeled in chunks. Moreau knocked. After a moment, the door opened a crack, revealing a man with thinning hair and a gaunt face etched by years of caution. "What do you want?" he asked. "Louis d'Argel?" Moreau asked. "Yes." Moreau held out his identification. "Inspector Moreau, we need to speak." D'Argels hesitated, then opened the door fully. Inside, the apartment smelled of stale tobacco and ink. Papers cluttered the table, some covered in figures and calculations. "Sit," D'Argel said grudgingly. "What is this about?" Moreau settled into a chair. "Monsieur Charenton." The name struck like a pebble tossed into still water. D'Argels flinched. His eyes darted toward the single window as though considering the possibility of escaping through it. "I have not heard that name in years," he muttered. "Yet you remember it clearly," Moreau said. "You lent him money." "Everyone knew that fool owed half the province," D'Argel spat. "He borrowed beyond his means, convinced fortunes would fall into his lap, but they never did." "Did you threaten him?" Moreau asked. D'Argel stiffened. "Threaten? I'm not a criminal, Inspector." "You're not known for gentleness either," Moreau replied quietly. D'Argel sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Charenton was in trouble. That much I knew, but not because of me. There was something else. Someone else." Moreau listened. "He mentioned a name once," D'Argels continued. "During one of his panicked visits, he said he was being followed, that someone wanted repayment in a way he could not give." "What name?" Moreau asked. Dargels rubbed his temples. He never said clearly, only initials, a single letter, in fact, S. He said S had discovered something he should never have known, that if he did not make amends, his wife would suffer. A chill moved through the room. Moreau exchanged a glance with Janvier. And the wife? Moreau asked. Did Charenton fear her? Fear? No, Dargels replied. Distrusted, perhaps. He accused her once in my presence. Said she kept secrets. But it was unclear whether he meant betrayal or something in her past. Moreau pressed. Were the initials S.I. or perhaps just C? Dargels shook his head. Only S. That much I remember. Moreau stood. Thank you. As they left Dargels' apartment, Janvier looked troubled. Do you think the initials behind the mirror connect to this S? They connect to something, Moreau said. Something Charenton feared. They returned to the street. The night had grown colder. Moreau glanced toward the nearest lamplight, watching the glow tremble in the wind. Janvier, he said quietly, have Lucas returned to the widow's apartment? Discreetly. I want to know who lives in the adjoining rooms. Janvier nodded and hurried off. Moreau walked alone along the street, letting the night settle over him. Charenton had lived in fear before he died. Fear of debts, of betrayal, of a person whose identity remained hidden beneath a single letter. Yet the mirror had become the center of everything. An object from a ruined actress, a relic that carried 2 sets of initials carved into its frame. Someone had carved them long before the widow brought the mirror to Paris. Someone connected to Charenton's past. He returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, where Lucas was already waiting with a hurried report. Inspector, Lucas said, I checked the adjoining apartments. The one beside the widow's, number 32, is rented by a man who has not been seen in 2 days. A quiet tenant, works late nights, keeps to himself. Name? Moreau asked. Stéphane Corvel, Lucas replied. Moreau froze. Corvel, initial S, initial C. The room grew still. Bring me everything on him, Moreau said sharply. Lucas hurried away. Moreau paced his office slowly, the name reverberating through the dim room. Corvel had lived beside the widow. Corvel had access to the wall behind the mirror. Corvel matched the initials, and Corvel had disappeared. By the time Lucas returned with the file, Moreau felt the pieces sliding into shape. Corvel had once lived in Tours. He had left the town the same year the widow did. He had no family, few acquaintances, and a narrow trail of odd jobs linking him to both provinces. His name had never appeared in the Charenton estate records, but the initials carved behind the mirror had not been meant for paper. Moreau inhaled deeply, feeling the gravity of the discovery settle. The mirror had not just been used, it had been prepared years before. Someone had built a confession into it, waiting for the right moment to unlock it. And now someone was imitating the dead, driving the widow toward the edge of her own fear. Moreau extinguished the lamp. The city's evening hum drifted faintly through the window. He knew what he must do now. Revisit the widow, revisit the mirror, revisit the death certificate. Step by step, he was moving toward a truth some had wanted buried 9 years ago. But the dead, it seemed, had begun speaking again. By morning, Paris had awakened with a nervous hum, as though the city itself sensed that something had begun to unravel behind its shutters. The Seine rolled beneath a thin blanket of mist, and the pale sky hung low over the rooftops, threatening rain. Inspector Moreau walked from his apartment near Saint-Sulpice toward the Quai des Orfèvres, with the silent urgency of a man moving deeper into a labyrinth. News had spread overnight. He could feel it in the way people leaned together in cafes, whispering behind cups of steaming coffee, their voices slipping through half-opened windows. Paris thrived on rumor, and now the city carried one with particular relish. A widow on Rue des Martyrs claimed her dead husband had begun speaking to her through a mirror. The first trace of it reached Moreau as he passed a small kiosk near Pont Neuf. The newspapers were stacked in uneven piles, their headlines bold and slanted. One of them, Le Matin, carried a teasing line at the bottom corner. "A widow's haunting, voice from the glass." The article was brief and speculative, the sort that sought to stir curiosity without committing to facts. But it was enough. Enough to turn the widow's private terror into a curiosity for strangers. Enough to embolden opportunists. Moreau purchased a copy and continued walking. The report mentioned no names, but it hinted at a notable inspector investigating a phantom-like phenomenon in Montmartre. Moreau felt his jaw tighten. He disliked being turned into a character in someone else's tale, particularly when the tale was built on half-truths and careless imagination. The city was a hungry thing. Once it caught hold of a story, it chewed on it until nothing but rumor remained. By the time he reached the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas was pacing outside his office with a folded newspaper in hand. "It's everywhere," Lucas said before Moreau could speak. "Cafés from the river to Montmartre are buzzing. People are asking if we've started hunting ghosts." "Ghosts do not trouble me," Moreau replied calmly. "People do." Lucas thrust the newspaper forward. "This is trouble. Someone is feeding the story." Moreau took the paper, skimming the lines again. The phrasing felt deliberate, too precise to be the work of a journalist guessing blindly. "This came from someone who knows more than they should." "You mean the widow?" Lucas asked. "No," Moreau said. "She fears her own shadow. She would never seek attention." He folded the paper. "This is the work of someone who wants distraction." Lucas frowned. "Distraction from what?" Moreau turned and entered his office. "From the truth." Janvier arrived moments later with a stack of freshly gathered notes. "Inspector," he said, closing the door behind him. "Something happened last night. A man was seen leaving the widow's building. Neighbors say he carried a small bag. They could not describe his face clearly. It was too dark. But they said he moved quietly, as though he knew the stairs." Moreau felt a shift of cold certainty. "Corvel." "That's what I thought," Janvier said. "He is avoiding his rooms. His landlord hasn't seen him since Monday." "Then he knows we're close," Moreau murmured. Janvier hesitated. "And there is something else. A journalist visited the building yesterday afternoon, asked about strange noises, asked whether the widow believed in spirits. Someone tipped him off." Moreau sat slowly, his gaze narrowing. Corvel was no fool. If he wished to keep attention away from himself, feeding the press a morsel of supernatural intrigue was a perfect strategy. The city's imagination would swell around the story, drowning out rational inquiry. And if the widow cracked under pressure, if she collapsed into fear or madness, Corvel could vanish unnoticed. Moreau rose abruptly. "We're going back to Rue des Martyrs." The ride through Paris was tense. Fog had begun to lift, but the light that replaced it felt thin and unsteady. Moreau watched the shadows cling to the buildings as the carriage climbed toward Montmartre. When they reached the widow's street, he stepped out before the horse had fully stopped. A cluster of neighbors lingered near the entrance, their expressions bright with curiosity and caution. Moreau felt their eyes follow him as he climbed the stairs to the third floor. He knocked. The widow opened the door with a trembling hand. Her face looked hollowed by a night without sleep. The shawl around her shoulders sagged as though its weight exceeded her own strength. "Inspector," she whispered. "They came?" Moreau felt a prickling at the back of his neck. "Who?" "The journalists," she said. "They knocked and knocked. They asked me to speak of the mirror." Her eyes moistened. I did not answer, but their voices, they sounded like jeers. Moreau stepped inside. The room was dim, curtains drawn tight. The mirror stood where it always had, but the air around it felt charged, as though the walls themselves were listening. Moreau moved closer, examining the frame once more. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt unstable. "Madame," he said carefully, "has the voice returned?" She nodded slowly. "At dawn. It was faint, but clearer than before. He called my name, and then he said, 'Tell him the truth.'" Moreau's gaze sharpened. "Tell who?" "You," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He said your name. Not the full name, but the sound of it. More, as if trying to guide me." A chill slid down Moreau's spine. Corvell was getting bold. He circled the room, examining the wall behind the mirror. The narrow channel he had discovered remained undisturbed, but he now noticed faint traces of dust displaced along the edges. Evidence of recent use. He pressed his ear lightly against the wall. Silence. But silence could hide a great deal. He turned to Janvier. "Check the adjoining apartment again. Thoroughly." Janvier nodded and slipped out. Moreau turned to the widow. "Madame, think carefully. Your husband, before he died, did he ever speak of someone with the initials SC?" Her face paled even further, as though the question itself was a blade. "Why do you ask that?" "It may be important," Moreau said softly. She swallowed. "There was someone, yes. A man who visited the estate when my husband was alive. They were friends once, or claimed to be, but my husband grew suspicious of him. He accused him of meddling, of learning things he should not. His name was Stéphane." She hesitated. "Stéphane Corvell." Moreau felt the entire room tilt slightly, as though the floorboards had shifted beneath them. "Why did he visit?" Moreau asked. "I don't know," she whispered. "My husband would not say. They argued, loudly, several times. And after your husband's death, he disappeared. I did not see him again until years later. In Paris, I thought it was coincidence. He kept to himself. I never spoke to him." Moreau stepped back from her slowly. Corvell had followed her, watched her, positioned himself beside her home, and now he used the mirror, the one tied to their past, to torment her with the voice of a man who had accused them both of betrayal. Janvier returned, his face drawn tight. "Inspector," he said, breathless, "Corvell's apartment is empty, but someone was there recently. There's a narrow crack in his wall connecting to the widow's. It aligns with the mirror's channel. He could speak through it." Moreau felt a cold certainty settle inside him. "He's not far." Lucas burst into the stairwell moments later. "Inspector, the journalist who wrote the article, he received the story from a man matching Corvell's description, at a cafe near Pigalle." Moreau's voice hardened. "Then Corvell wants attention diverted. He wants a city chasing phantoms while he manipulates the living." He turned to the widow, who clutched her shawl with trembling fingers. "Madame, you are not haunted. You are hunted." The words seemed to echo through the dim apartment, settling into the corners like dust stirred from an old wound. Moreau moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the street below. People moved about their errands, unaware of the quiet storm brewing above them. Somewhere among them, Corvell was watching, waiting for his next opportunity. Stirring the press was not his mistake, Moreau murmured. It was his confession. He stepped back into the room, his decision firm. "Janvier. Lucas, we find Corvell tonight." The mirror behind him reflected the dim shapes of all three men, but beneath the glass, it felt as though another reflection, fainter, older, waited for its moment to resurface. Night descended over Paris with an unsettling stillness, the kind that seemed to muffle the very pulse of the streets. Inspector Moreau moved through the fog-draped alleys near Pigalle with Janvier and Lucas keeping close. Each lamplight flickered in the wind as though reluctant to illuminate what lay ahead. Corvell had slipped through the city like smoke, leaving traces, suggestions, but nothing solid enough to seize. Still, Moreau felt the man's presence as distinctly as a shadow, lingering just outside the circle of lamplight. This was no ghost. This was someone who understood fear and how to wield it with precision. They reached the cafe described by the journalist, a narrow establishment tucked between a bookshop and a shuttered tailor's shop. The air inside smelled of roasted chicory and spilled wine. The crowd was thin, just a few laborers lingering after their shift and an elderly man reading a newspaper beneath the solitary wall sconce. The owner, polishing glasses behind the counter, looked up with weary suspicion until Moreau flashed his identification. Recognition replaced caution. "You're looking for the man who spoke to that reporter," the owner said quietly, leaning close. "He came in 2 nights ago. Sat in the back corner, watched the door more than his drink." "Did he say his name?" Moreau asked. "No, but he asked strange questions, about how voices carry through old walls, about fear, about guilt." The owner wrinkled his brow. He spoke like a man rehearsing something he had waited years to say. Moreau's gaze hardened. "Did he come alone?" "Yes," the owner said, "but he left in a hurry, as though he sensed someone following him. Went out the back." "Show me." The owner led them through a narrow corridor that emptied into a dim courtyard. Moisture clung to the stones, glistening in the gaslight that seeped through the alley. Moreau scanned the walls, noting the soot-marked bricks and a wooden gate that opened onto a side street. He touched the gate. The latch had been forced recently. Corvel was moving with haste now, abandoning subtlety. Moreau spoke softly to Janvier. "He's frightened. When fear drives a man, he makes mistakes." Janvier nodded. "Or becomes dangerous." Moreau's thoughts turned to the widow, the mirror, the voice that mimicked a dead man with chilling precision. Corvel had woven his scheme with remarkable patience, engineering a channel behind the mirror, carving initials, positioning himself beside the widow's room for months. This was no impulsive torment. This was architecture, deliberate, obsessive. But what was the foundation? They moved through the alley, emerging onto a street lined with shuttered bistros and unlit windows. A cat darted across the path, startled by their steps. The city felt unnaturally hushed, as though it too were waiting for something to be revealed. As they turned a corner, a figure emerged briefly beneath a lamp-post before disappearing down another street. Moreau caught a glimpse. Slight build, cap pulled low, coat flaring behind him. Corvel. "Lucas, left," Moreau called. They ran. Their footsteps echoed sharply against the stones. Corvel moved quickly, but Moreau noticed something strange in his gait, an unevenness, as though one leg carried an old injury. That detail anchored the memory of Tours, a rumor about a man who fought with Charenton shortly before his death, leaving with a limp and a cut across his cheek. The chase led them through a warren of side streets until Corvel vanished into a courtyard behind an abandoned wine shop. Moreau slowed, listening. The air felt taut, straining with withheld breath. A faint creak came from the shadows. Moreau raised a hand, signaling silence. "Corvel," he said into the darkness. Voice calm, steady. "You've run enough. Come out." Nothing. Janvier stepped carefully to the right, scanning the recesses beneath a staircase. Lucas edged toward the broken crates stacked near the back wall. Moreau remained at the center of the courtyard, knowing Corvel might respond only to him. "I know who you were," Moreau said, his tone measured. "I know what you saw in Tours, and I know why you carved those initials into the mirror." The shadows shifted. A figure emerged slowly, the dim light revealing a narrow face, unkempt hair, and eyes that burned with something darker than fear. Corvel stepped forward just enough for the lamplight to catch the glint of sweat on his forehead. "You don't know anything," Corvel said, his voice breaking on the edges of anger and desperation. Moreau kept his stance relaxed. "Then tell me." Corvel's lip curled. She didn't tell you the truth. She told me parts, Moreau replied. You can tell me the rest. Corvell laughed, a hollow sound. Elise Charenton. She plays innocence well. Her husband believed her lies until the end. But he died without knowing the truth. I won't let her forget. Moreau observed him carefully. The man's entire being seemed tethered to a single, unresolved grievance, something that had anchored itself in his mind for nearly a decade. This isn't about debt, Moreau said, or inheritance. This is personal. Corvell's jaw clenched. She ruined him. How? Moreau asked. Corvell hesitated, breath quickening. She was in love. With someone else. She tried to hide it, but Charenton wasn't a fool. He found the letters. He confronted her. She denied it, but he knew. He always knew. And when he confronted the other man... The other man, Moreau asked quietly. Who? Pain flickered through Corvell's eyes, raw and unguarded. Me. The word hung in the air like smoke. Moreau felt the pieces shift. The double initials, the quarrels, the visits to the estate, the sudden disappearance after Charenton's death. This was not a story of extortion or revenge for debt. This was the wreckage of passion turned into obsession. You were her lover, Moreau said softly. Corvell's voice cracked. She promised she would leave him. She begged me to wait, and I did. But when he confronted me, I couldn't lie. I told him the truth. He was furious. She heard us. She came running. His breath hitched. He died that night. Moreau felt the tension coil tightly. Did you kill him? No, Corvell cried, stepping forward. Janvier raised a hand, but Moreau gestured for calm. I didn't touch him. He collapsed, just collapsed. His heart gave out. She screamed. She begged me to help her carry him to the bed. She said no one must know. She feared the scandal, feared losing everything. She begged me to disappear, and I obeyed. Moreau's voice remained steady. So why torment her now? Corvell's gaze hardened. Because she lied, he whispered. She sent me away like a stain on her reputation. Promised she'd write. Promised she'd join me. But she never came. She abandoned me. And then, years later, I learned she'd taken the mirror. Our mirror. The one we used to meet beside when her husband was away. Moreau's jaw tightened. The initials carved in the frame, hers and Corvell's. A symbol of a love hidden and then discarded. A broken promise turned into festering bitterness. You wanted her to confess, Moreau said. She must, Corvell murmured. She must admit what happened. She must feel what I felt. So you imitated the dead, Moreau said. You carved a voice out of pain. Corvell nodded slowly. It was easy. The walls are old, brittle. I remembered the estate's architecture. I knew how sound could travel. When she heard him speak her name, I saw her break. She deserved it. Moreau stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. You may not have killed Charenton, but you are destroying the living. Corvell's eyes glistened. Then let her speak. Let her tell the world what she did. Moreau exhaled. She didn't kill him. Corvell looked stricken. Moreau continued softly, but neither did you. Silence pooled in the courtyard. The wind rustled papers near the crates. But what you have done, Moreau said, his voice low, is manipulate a grieving woman into madness. That ends tonight. Corvell's shoulders sagged, all defiance draining from him. Janvier stepped forward to restrain him, but Corvell did not resist. His breath came shallowly, as though surrender had hollowed him out. As they led him toward the street, Moreau glanced back at the narrow courtyard, its shadows returning to stillness. The architect of this torment had been found. Not a ghost, not a supernatural force, but a man consumed by resentment and loss. And yet Moreau sensed something unresolved, something the widow had not told him, something the mirror still held, like a final whisper trapped behind glass. Dawn crept slowly over Paris, soft and hesitant, as though the sky itself was reluctant to reveal what the night had left behind. Inspector Moreau crossed the Pont au Change at first light, the river beneath him shifting like dull pewter. Newspapers would soon go out, kiosks would open, and the city would begin whispering anew. But for now, Paris lay in a rare hush. It was the kind of mourning that softened even the harshest truths. Yet Moreau carried the weight of a truth that could not be softened, only understood. Corvel had been taken into custody after the night's confrontation. Janvier had escorted him to the Quai des Orfèvres, where Corvel sat now in a small, windowless room, his expression a mixture of defeat and exhaustion. But Moreau had not questioned him yet. The night had drained the man. Interrogation would come later. For now, Moreau walked toward Rue des Martyrs with a simmering certainty that the widow deserved to hear the truth from his own mouth, not as accusation, not as absolution, but as clarity. The climb up Rue des Martyrs felt heavier than before. Each step pressed against the pavement as though the city itself resisted the morning's revelations. When he reached the widow's building, he paused beneath the sagging awning, listening for voices. None came. The neighbors who had earlier crowded the stairwell were still asleep behind their shutters. Paris, so eager to gossip the night before, now slumbered in ignorance. Moreau ascended the stairs slowly, his hand brushing the banister worn smooth by decades of hands. At the third-floor landing, he knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. Madame Charenton stood there, shawl gathered around her shoulders, eyes swollen from a night spent without rest. Her gaze sought his as though searching for an anchor. "Inspector," she whispered, "you found him." Moreau nodded. "Yes." She stepped aside, allowing him into the dim apartment. The air held the faint scent of lavender, though weaker now, as if the room itself had grown tired of masks. The mirror stood in its usual place, silent and unlit. Morning light filtered around the curtains, casting a pale sheen across the glass. "Please," she said softly, her voice fragile, "tell me everything." Moreau removed his coat and placed it gently over the back of a chair. He took a moment before speaking, choosing his words with the precision the moment required. "Madame," he began, "your husband's death was sudden, yes, but not the result of violence. His heart failed him, exactly as recorded. But that night there was an argument, a brutal one. You know that." Corvel confirmed it. At the mention of the name, the widow recoiled ever so slightly, her hands tightening around the shawl. "I never wanted that name spoken in this home again," she whispered. "I know," Moreau said gently, "but we cannot move forward without acknowledging it." She stared at him, trembling. Charenton confronted him, she said, voice barely audible. "I remember the shouting. I remember Stéphane's face, pale, shocked, and then I remember my husband collapsing. I remember screaming." Moreau studied her expression. "You asked Corvel to help move the body." She flinched as though struck. "I did not want people to think—" Her breath faltered. It was a moment of panic. "I loved my husband in my way, Inspector. But our life had become twisted by suspicion. And when Corvel left Tours," Moreau said quietly, "you let him go." She closed her eyes. "I needed my life back. I needed silence." Moreau nodded slowly. "And for 9 years, that silence held, until Corvel found you again." Her breath shook. "He used the mirror," she whispered, staring at the frame. "Why? Why choose that object?" Moreau approached the mirror, touching the carved initials with his fingertips. "Because this mirror held the memory of your affair, those initials. You did not carve them, did you?" She shook her head. No. Corvell did, Moreau said. Long ago. Perhaps to mark a moment between you. Perhaps as a secret gesture of possession. When he learned you still kept the mirror, he saw it as betrayal. Proof that you had carried a piece of him into your new life, yet denied him any place in your future. Tears welled in her eyes. I brought it with me because it belonged to the estate. Nothing more. Moreau continued gently. Corvell convinced himself otherwise, and when he discovered he lived beside you in Paris, when he realized how close he was to the object that once represented your bond, his resentment rekindled. The mirror became his instrument. She clasped her hands tightly, as though holding something fragile. He imitated my husband's voice, all this time? Yes, Moreau said. He used the channel behind the wall. He whispered through it, knowing your memories would do the rest. Her tears fell freely now. He wanted to punish me. He wanted you to confess, Moreau said. Confess to abandoning him. Confess to hiding the truth about that night. Confess anything that would validate his pain. She shook her head violently. But I did not kill my husband, and I did not destroy Corvell's life. He walked away. He chose to vanish. Moreau's eyes softened. Pain has its own logic, madame. It does not obey reason. It rarely listens to truth. She sank into her chair, the shawl slipping from her shoulders like a discarded skin. The room felt unbearably quiet, as though the mirror itself was listening. Inspector, she whispered, did you tell him I never meant to hurt him? Moreau hesitated. He knows, he said at last. Whether he accepts it, that is another matter. She exhaled shakily, her gaze drifting toward the mirror. Morning light had grown stronger. The glass caught its faint glow, losing some of the darkness that had clung to it for days. Moreau approached it slowly. Madame Charenton, he said softly, you do not have to keep this mirror. It has held too much of your past, too many shadows. You may let it go. Her eyes widened slightly. But it came from my husband's family. And before that, Moreau said, from a woman whose life collapsed in scandal. Objects absorb more than dust, madame. They absorb memory. And sometimes, memory becomes a prison. Silence settled between them. Then, slowly, deliberately, she stood. Together they lifted the mirror from the wall. It was heavy, heavier than its appearance suggested. The wood creaked faintly as Moreau leaned it against the floor, face turned in toward the corner. The room immediately seemed lighter. I will not let it haunt me, she said, voice trembling but resolute. Moreau nodded. He gathered his coat and moved toward the door. Before leaving, he looked at her once more. She stood near the window, framed by soft morning light, no longer the fragile figure, trembling before shadows, but a woman confronting the past she had long tried to bury. Madame, he said gently, the voice is gone now. Only your own remains. She bowed her head in gratitude. Moreau stepped into the stairwell, closing the door with a quiet click. As he descended, he felt the weight of the case settling, not as victory, not as closure, but as understanding. Some crimes left no bodies. Some hauntings left no ghosts. But the wounds they carved were real all the same. On the street, dawn had brightened. Merchants lifted their shutters, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery. Life resumed. Moreau walked toward the Seine, stopping briefly at the parapet to look at the river. Fog drifted along its surface, thin and ghost-like, dissolving in the strengthening light. He watched it fade, feeling the last echoes of the case retreat gently from his mind. The river flowed on, carrying the city's secrets with it. Some whispered, some forgotten, some still waiting beneath the surface for the moment they would rise again. Inspector Moreau lit a cigarette, inhaled, and stepped away from the railing. Paris stretched before him, alive with new mysteries in the making. The mirror, at last, had fallen silent.